In order to understand global political economy, we must take international economic institutions, also known as global economic governance institutions, into account. The first ones were created around the 1940s and 50s, and since the 80s there has been a huge increase in their number. Although we haven't talked about their role yet, they are highly criticized for being dominated by the US and due to the fact that they have favored the implementation of neoliberal policies. They have also promulgated these ideas to third world countries, which have depended on their funding and loans. This has also been a cause for critiques, as these institutions are said to be hurdling the independent development of these countries. However, to understand the origin of these institutions and the debates they raised, we must go back to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The Bretton Woods Conference consisted in negotiations between the Allied powers, and its goal was to achieve a world economic order based on liberalism after the Second World War. There were two propositions on how this could be achieved. On one hand, the delegation of the US, led by Harry Dexter White, wanted a liberal system built on American economic leadership and based on the currency. Secondly, the British delegation, with John Maynard Keynes, preferred basing the system on redistribution of income and wealth. However, they agreed on the American proposal, and the leadership became known as hegemonic. They used forms of consensus, for instance in the aid given by the US to Western countries and Japan, but they also used coercion, for example in the use of the military to contain the spread of communism. Anyway, US hegemony didn't last long. In the late 60s, European economies gained power and the US economy experienced a decline. The value of the dollar began to be questioned too, so in 1971, the US devaluated the dollar's gold exchange rate by 10%, and 2 years later, the US took the decision to have a monetary order without leaders. The key mechanisms and institutions set up at the conference were currency stability that consisted in fixed exchange rates. It was based on the dollar due to the greater importance of the American economy. Convertibility to the dollar was also a key point, and non-convertible currencies were not tradable internationally. Credit and financing institutions. They set up ways to get credits through the IMF. It was also used to help third world countries in the short run. For long-term changes, they relied on US aid. Another of these institutions is the World Bank, which had the objective of helping weaker states to deal with war destruction and uneven development. However, the bank could not offer much of this assistance. Promotion of freer international trade and investment. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was created in 1948. It aimed at reducing tariffs and reducing discrimination between countries over time through so-called negotiation rounds. In the 90s, it was integrated into the World Trade Organization, which is used to reach binding agreements on trade, intellectual property rights, etc. It seeks to create free international agreements, but doesn't have an incredible success. There were also disagreements about these institutions, as the UK set a fund to encourage development and structural adjustment, but the US set up a smaller fund so it could have an easier domination of the system, although after the Second World War it did not have a lot of activity. Third world countries have not been too favorable of these institutions, firstly because they are known to be dominated by the US, elitist and conservative, so these countries have been greatly excluded. Secondly, the IMF and the World Bank have had little resources and power to do much, partly because of US dominance. This caused that in the 1960s and 70s they carried out their own agenda based on development through UN institutions. Therefore, there was the emergence of different projects. There were also third world organizations formed, such as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Group of 77. They aimed at promoting the industrialization of the Third World through 5 objectives. The new International Economic Order program was adopted in response to this pressure. However, the importance of these institutions was reduced by the change in the financing of Third World borrowing made by the OPEC, as the restrictions on borrowing disappeared. The high interest rates and the failures of development programs led to the debt crisis of the 80s. In 1971, the IMF and the World Bank saw the roles change. They started to focus on Third World structural adjustment, which in fact wanted to clear the obstacles to free trade.
Created using Powtoon.